And prior to going live, I was just chatting with her about the new social media platform, Clubhouse, which is different to Haps. Haps deals with the visual and audio elements. Clubhouse is audio only, but it's provided a way for some people to rub shoulders. And Caleigh's been having these dense discussions, including with one insightful director. So she was about to tell me about it, and we realized, let's hold that thought and have this conversation live so that people can share in the interest factor. Tell me more, Caleigh. Oh, sorry, no. Let's do it. Welcome, Caleigh. Caleigh is an actor, and I so want to say actress, but I guess that's probably ingrained patriarchal dynamics in my personality that I should maybe get rid of, because actor is the preferred term, isn't it?
To be frank, I am not 100% sure, because I don't 100% care either way. I'm one of those people that even when I was a flight attendant, I remember so often hearing people being corrected when they would say stewardess, that, that's not politically correct. You call them a flight attendant now. And I don't know. I think I just have an aversion to labels in general, where it's like, you can call me whatever you want because I'm an actress and I respond to pretty much any name, any character. I love getting into the role play of it. And it's not, I think that debate over the labels comes from an egocentric place and a space of ideology, which is sort of what we were getting at before we hopped on here.
Well, it's interesting because I realize, yes, my attraction to the word actress is because it sounds as if it has some kind of dramatic flair to it. There's more sibilant consonants at the end. Actress, you can have more drama as you say it, which is why I want to apply it to you. But yes, it is part of an ideological push to say we're changing things and the new is always good because human progress is always forwards or something. And then there's a lot of pushback on that from people who are a little bit more conservative, who say, hey, well, we don't unquestioningly accept that new is always good. So do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages of changing things? And I'm happy to say, well, sometimes, but at the same time, yes, you've got to prioritize what you devote the majority of your energy towards. So yes, if we devote all of our energy towards policing terminology like actress and actor, then maybe there's some key things we're overlooking that we could be devoting more energy to.
Absolutely. I mean, you're hitting on a lot of deeply ingrained issues, some that are still being debated up here in Canada, as well as far as even just the terms that we use to address people in a non-binary manner. That's been a political debate that has put a hot spot, a light on people like Jordan Peterson, who is a professor at the University of Toronto in particular. I can't remember, I think it was Bill C-111. I might be incorrect on the number of it, but there was a bill that was being put forward for legislature that was, it had to do with essentially the language that we use to address one another. And there was a lot of heated debate on the campuses. And I'm not an expert on this area. I know I'm also not a politician. So
you're still an observer of what's happening. Which
I am an observer, and I find it fascinating. I don't love to get too politically involved in, I guess, taking one side or the other. I'm just very fascinated about debate and democracy, as we were talking about before. But it got very heated on campus, where a lot of pushback was coming from students who felt like they were not being heard and wanted to be addressed by certain terminology. And I don't remember the entire list of pronouns that were being proposed. I know that there was they and zed, and a lot of my friends also now address themselves as they instead of he or she. But the idea of tethering ourselves so tightly to labels is what I find so fascinating, because, and maybe this is why I became an actress or an actor, a crazy little monkey that just loves to hop into all of these different forms that are archetypal in nature, in deeply ingrained levels of our psyche, in ways that we immediately recognize, these archetypes that are immediately evident in commercials or in television shows or in any kind of story, any kind of narrative, that they kind of have to be readily recognizable in order for us to then move on to the grander story or the message of what that theory or question that the filmmaker or poet or storyteller is trying to bring across. So I do find it fascinating that they are useful. Categorization and labeling is useful, especially when it comes to things like mental health, which we've spoken about before when you were on my podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on the intersection between mass media culture and mental health.
And it's called We Are Not Okay.
We're totally not okay.
We're totally not okay.
But that's okay. And it's one of those things that project in particular grew out of this organic, insatiable curiosity that I have about what's happening on those deeper levels of our psyche when it comes to identifying with a label or a character.
Yes. Well, there's clearly lots of advantages to consider about labels, because there's lots of power inherent in using them and applying them and categorizing and making quick judgments. And then there's a disadvantages to making quick judgments as well. So there's a lot of complexity there. And I think people have an either explicit or implicit understanding of that, which is why culture wars are frustrating, because yes, there's a lot of progressive or woke people who want to push forward with social change. And that becomes such a large looming issue because conservatives often see the political value in framing that as the only important topic of conversation, because it does make some people uncomfortable, and change makes some people uncomfortable. But feeling compelled to change by the ability of young people to be more vocal and to shame adults, to shame their elders for not using the right terminology. I think it's really interesting because the person I know who shames people the most about what terminology they use is my mother-in-law, who I adore, but she's done a PhD, and so she's quite, it's more than woke. She's castigating people sometimes for not using terminology that I've never heard anybody else use. But she's really, she'll tell you you're using the wrong term. And her family sometimes laugh a little bit along with this, but I think it shows a broader picture of it's a coalition of young people and people from academic circles who are telling us, use this, not that. And that there are advantages to that push, that we are being challenged to consider the implications of how we use language. But the other challenge is it fuels fascism. It does. I don't want to victim blame too much, but a little bit of the virtue signaling. And I'm going to point to white liberal people here so that I'm not unfairly criticizing people of color who are actually fighting for very real improvements to be made in a context of systemic persecution and deprivation of opportunity for decades and as well as hundreds of years. So yes, white liberals who are being rewarded at a dopamine level for saying, say actor, not actress. And yes, that's a big conversation. But to go back to the use of it, you were talking about how archetypes and labels are actually really useful jumping points for actors' work, for exploring characters and for exploring the ways different stereotypes resonate with the audience. Sometimes they're going to resonate with our biases. Sometimes they're going to activate our confirmation biases and make us feel comfortable. And then as consumers, we'll be like, yes, we're being catered to. Our biases are being played into. And sometimes, I think this is probably more the case with theatre, we'll pay money for a ticket to actively feel discomfort. Do you think that's true? Have you noticed any difference across mediums for audiences coming to see a show in a way that makes them more prepared to be challenged and to have their preconceptions challenged?
That's a fascinating question. And it's something that I was speaking to actually a couple of weeks ago. I'm a moderator on a panel for one of the, there's, I don't know if you've brought this up on your show yet, but the social media platform Clubhouse that it has different rooms, different clubs, and I'm a moderator on a panel for a room that is called The Psychology of Horror. And we were talking about exactly that. What sorts of ways do filmmakers in particular, because that's what most of the artists in that room do, they're filmmakers.
Oh, sorry, 1 second, darling. I'll be right back. Keep talking because there's audio. I've just got 1 second.
Sure. I'll tell the listeners about Clubhouse and what this room is. The Psychology of Horror, we typically break down we'll address the narratives more so, but for that particular conversation, we were talking about the ways in which filmmakers can set up their audiences to essentially be prepared to be scared, because it's not only one thing to bring a story to somebody that is intentionally drawing on their fears and trying to instigate some sort of reaction from them, but we're moving into more and more stories that are trying to manipulate the platforms themselves, or play with the psychosis of the psychology of the audience members that are stepping into it. And that's their way of rising fear out of them. You think of War of the Worlds, the radio broadcast that was groundbreaking because it was essentially tricking millions of people into believing that it really was the end of the world. And it didn't give any kind of heads up. It moved into its narrative in a way that was done differently from how radio plays were typically done, to trick people into believing that it was real. And what was interesting to me about that in particular was the fact that Orson Welles, when it got to the point where they said, okay, people actually believe this and you need to stop, the mental health of our society is kind of at stake, he didn't want to. It was more about the actual social experiment that fascinated him. That was his art. So it was taking that platform on its head and flipping it on its head, much in the same way that I'm starting to see, with other platforms. I see some people in the comments asking where in Canada I'm at. I'm Toronto based. I am dying to go back out west because I miss mountains and the ocean, but I've been a city girl for the past 10-ish years. And hi, John, saying hello. Hi, Craig. Bring it back to platforms, and Gav is back. Perfect timing. What's fascinating is that I had a go Maple Leafs. Yeah. See, that's the one thing, is that as a Canadian, I'm a bad Canadian in the sense that I think the only sport that I never played was hockey. And I own a pair of hockey skates, but I cannot stop on them if there are not boards for me to crash into. So I feel a little bit of shame around that, being a Canadian, because I think that that's supposed to be part of my identity, bringing it kind of full circle back to identity. But hello, back to Dav.
Thank you so much for covering for me. That was an emergency. But I see my audience were embracing you as Dav in absentia as well. So that's awesome. You can fill in any time on my daily broadcast if you have, if you don't have your own broadcast and your own projects to do, which admittedly I'm sure you do, because an actor's work is never done. There's always people to talk to and pots to stir, probably.
Yeah, funnily enough, I suppose that's true. I was mentioning before we hopped on live that I've been intentionally trying to take a step back from social media because of how much it does also kind of consume. It can consume life. Like we were saying, it's algorithmically detailed so as to keep our attention as much as possible. And I'm trying to learn how to sleep again properly.
Yeah, I completely relate to what you've said. And I know I have been a force for disrupting my audience's sleep patterns for a long time now, because this is sleep time for, well, actually no, because I'm broadcasting earlier, but I typically broadcast a few hours from now, and I'm going to pay for it later that I haven't napped. But at least it's not my audience paying for it today. So I apologize to everybody for messing with your sleep. And I know that it's always a perpetual challenge for all of us that are involved in social media and are politically active or sort of concerned about political developments, that we can struggle with sleep, because modern media gives you access to the news at all hours of the day. And particularly when Trump was in power, I know there was that impetus to refresh. What has he done now? Even when there's nothing we could possibly do about it, the thing we sometimes felt deputized to do or compelled to do was make noise, to complain, and to hope that the ripples of that complaint and that noise kept spreading out in the community so that more people would at least vote Trump out when given an opportunity. And you know what? That did happen. So hopefully all of our sleep sacrifices were worth it. But now we have to learn how to sleep again under a Biden administration, while still devoting some of our energies to protecting Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, for one, I'm willing to give up I've become, I don't know, ancient over the past week, and this is already now past my bedtime, just according to my sleep schedule for the past week. But staying up to stay connected with people who are around the world is one of the things that I do find cool about today's technology. And as much as it's, I feel that I do remember how much I was refreshing and devastatingly glued to my television screen with the amount of turmoil that, especially at the beginning of even now, the turmoil unfortunately does not seem to end. And I have to, at least for myself, purposefully keep myself away from the news or from social media if I am going to give myself some sort of regularity with my sleep schedule. But even as some of your audience members in the chat section are mentioning, the Kavanaugh court is about to exercise its strength. We were talking about this before we hopped on to air, that, yeah, there is a strong possibility that the Supreme Court is going to overturn some laws that have been blessings in so many people's lives. And what that looks like down the road, sure, not necessarily going to completely overturn, I don't know if it completely does overturn Roe v. Wade, but it will undermine it greatly. And again, I guess just with you, I do get into kind of political realms, but this is something that I haven't been able to completely keep my eyes away from. And that, yeah, of course, if I hop onto Twitter, that's one of the first things that I've been seeing buzzing at my phone, that the kind of restrictions that would come up and the challenges, how much more difficult it would be for somebody in a plethora of states to get an abortion, what that means as a consequence, how many more abortions would become illegal, or I think the Times was saying that the number of women having abortion pills mailed to them because they can't afford to drive across the border to a state that still has a clinic that will do abortions legally, or to just have them done illegally, or even have money to cover a babysitter so that they can go do that. It's just, there are so many different restrictions that are going to have to be taken into consideration if, say, an entire state decides to close down their clinics. And
that's quite likely. It's quite likely to happen, because a lot of the Republican states have enacted bans, 6-week, 15-week bans, and the upcoming Supreme Court decision will potentially validate all of those bans. So it could be very challenging for women who live in red states to get access to any type of reproductive choice opportunities in a medical sense. And I think in Texas, they're introducing a bill that allows people to sue abortion providers, but also to sue people who've driven a friend to a clinic. Like literally, you could be sued for driving someone to a clinic to get an abortion. And that's going to obviously tie up the resources and the time and the energy of people who are in charge of running clinics, and make it essentially impossible to get safe, legal abortions. And I've never had one, but you shouldn't have to have had need of abortion to be able to relate to the idea that it is torturous for a woman to be compelled by the state to proceed with a pregnancy for any reason against her will. if she has a baby with a terminal illness that doctors have said will not survive, how can you be forced to carry that pregnancy? And that's admittedly a very small proportion of pregnancies, but it's a significant reason for people having abortions in late term pregnancies, that they're often complicated, very distressing medical circumstances for parents. And my heart just goes out to all the people who are stressed. And you can't anticipate needing an abortion because presumably people will always try to avoid it. But when you have millions upon millions of people, accidents happen, and just for that safeguard to be taken away, that idea that you might have to carry a pregnancy against your will.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with friends, and it's funny how I myself have also never had an abortion. And when asked by a friend, you know, if you were in that situation, hypothetically, what would you do? I cannot fathom what I would feel like in those circumstances, because as much as we like to think that we can theorize what those circumstances would be and insinuate all the different emotional affects that would come from the different pressure points of that kind of a situation, you never know what your innate gut will drive you to do and force you to choose what is right for you in that moment until you have those externalities, those external circumstances and pressures put upon you. So I myself, you know, I have not been able to put myself in those shoes literally. Nor would I want to have to make that kind of a decision, because that is huge. I do know that as far as my own physical health goes, I have endometriosis, and that has been an interesting journey for me to even discover with the help of a plethora of different physicians, either from Western medicine or Eastern medicine, and also having a sister who is a scientist. She did a lot of research and dug up information when I was in my younger years, trying to figure out what my pains were coming from. And for those who don't know what endometriosis is, it's essentially for this during your cycle, for a woman having her period, instead of being able to go through a regular cycle that essentially everything moves out of your body, mine doesn't. I developed the lining on the outside of my uterus, or at least some of it, and now I'm essentially like bleeding internally, and there's nowhere for the blood to go, and there's no remedy, there's no cure for endometriosis. It essentially over time just coagulates. It cements your other organs together if it's pretty extreme. I believe that there are 4 stages of it, and to efficiently diagnose it, you have to actually undergo surgery. And the same way of being able to even just deal with the complications, you'd have to undergo surgery to essentially scrape out everything that does not belong there. And it's not a fun. I've had friends who have also gone through it, and it's not fun. You can have stage 4 endometriosis and feel no pain, have no side effects, and you can live fine. And it's from what we know, because it's still very young in its studies, but you can also have stage 1 and have extreme pain. And for me, I suffered a lot from the pain of it as a teen growing up and trying to figure out what was happening to my body. And the number of, I hate to say it, this is just the facts, older white male physicians who either did not believe my pain or thought it was attributable to something else like IBS, or just kind of gave me the runaround. And even at the point once I finally did get diagnosed, having a gynecologist who was very old school, very caring, and helped me uncover a lot of the details of my prognosis, but didn't want to put me under the knife because it also reduced my fertility abilities. And he wanted me to be able to keep that intact because I, as a woman, am made to have children. And it wasn't even didn't even ask me if I wanted to have kids. It was very fascinating to see how different doctors also dealt with that diagnosis. So to put your health in somebody else's hands, and to have laws dictating what you are allowed and not allowed to do with your own body, and the terms of how you live your life is just, it's a very scary notion. And I think that a lot of it comes back to, what we started off talking about with labels. It comes to the language, especially when we're talking about law. These are words, and it can be equivocated to, biblically speaking, the way that the Bible opens up with saying that, I can't remember exactly how it's stated, but the fact that, God first there was word, that essentially becomes law as well. Because once we put things into word and sign it off, that dictates how we are allowed to behave and govern ourselves, and dictates our agency. It plays with our agency. So language, yes, much like the debates that have been happening up here, or at least a few years back. I'm not entirely sure where the debates with Jordan Peterson and the bill that dictates the pronouns that we're allowed to use with each other, where it actually sits. I know that it didn't get passed, but I doubt that it has been buried. But language itself is it's so fascinating to see how it has come to shape our lives, whether it's storytellers or governors.
I'm so intrigued by something you raised, which is that doctor wanted to preserve your fertility without having had a discussion with you about that. It wasn't client-centric. It was just a baseline assumption, preserve fertility.
Yeah.
And it made me realize, yes, there's a degree to which women are perceived as societal property, because we're part of the collective societal need to have a continuation of society through reproduction. So in that way, women uniquely, as opposed to men, are still viewed as appropriate targets for commentary and laws governing their body and the exercise of their bodily capacities. So they have to tell you, no, you can't circumscribe your fertility. That's what the government will try to do through the branch of government that is the judicial branch. The Supreme Court is likely just about to tell American women, don't think that you get to make those choices. This is society's choices to say, maximize babies. And in a way that they're probably driven by a conservative agenda of maximize feudal dynamics of impoverished people who have to accept low wages so that they can have restricted social mobility and just have to spend all their waking hours trying to labor enough to put food on the table. That's what compulsory pregnancy does to people. Compulsory pregnancy makes them continue to have children regardless of their financial circumstances or their physical circumstances of what it might say for their health, etc. It tends to say, nope, it's just compulsory because we accept this as a moral precept that all conceptions are ordained to proceed, which is usually the hallmark of a more sort of primitive society that says, okay, yeah, we're losing a lot of people to fires and floods and starvation, so all babies, you've got to go ahead with them. So you are the property of society when the doctor was saying, at all costs, we've got to preserve your fertility. You might have been like, no, doctor, I actually don't want to have children, and I would prefer to avoid pain. Like, that is my priority. Absolutely go ahead and mess with my fertility. And he's like, that's not for you to decide, little lady. You might change your mind later on. I'm looking to this overarching principle of maximize baby making ability amongst the ladies.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned those who are impoverished and how much more challenging it becomes, not just when you segregate men from women, but when you now take a look at the different, essentially in a caste system, and where people sit financially, their capabilities of being able to have means to these, and not just what it means for their physical health, but their mental health. I was listening to a podcast kind of about this, not exactly on this notion, but just talking about why, how the transgression of mental health, how these days, I think they were comparing back to data from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and how nowadays even children who qualify as being depressed, quote unquote, is 5 to 8 times higher than what it was in the 30s, when poverty was still such a big issue back in the 30s. So there's something incredibly horrendous that we're doing to ourselves, and that it's something outside of our material success that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. Suicide rates are going up, particularly among women. These days, women can vote, they can step further into the career world, they can have abortions for the most part right now. This is all in obviously some parts of the world, and that's also on a teeter right now, but there's something so much more complicated at play when it comes to our levels of contentedness, our levels of feeling fulfilled or happy, likely something much deeper.
That's true. That's such an important point, because it's not just men in the Supreme Court. It very notably will be a woman on the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. Without her, the Roe v. Wade decision probably wouldn't get overturned, and she's the likely candidate whose vote's going to be critical to overturning it. But that maybe there's an understanding amongst women that greater freedom has the capacity to create space for greater levels of depression. That all those opportunities can lead women to go, oh, maybe I haven't achieved enough. Because women are still often conditioned to be people pleasers. And when you send people pleasers out into the world, maybe they can get really dissatisfied if they don't achieve in ways that they expect for themselves. So yes, modernity and freedom for women carries amazing opportunities that can lift economies, that can do all sorts of things. But yeah, we have to look and say, just to be aware that there's these potential attendant issues of mental health that are corollaries to greater freedom and greater wealth. And that on some level, conservative women might know that and say, secretly, ladies, you might yearn for a simpler time when all that was expected of you was to have a baby. So that might explain some of the female support for these things. And I think that's important to understand, because you have to understand people's arguments if you want to counter them. And look, I'll leave the door open to maybe understand and be persuaded by them, but I don't think there's that much chance that I'm going to be persuaded by conservative arguments that women are happier when they have less choices, that women are fundamentally more contented, even if it's true. Like, there's clearly an element of truth to it that, actually, no, I say clearly, and it's not really clear to me. I'll go and look at some data, but it's intuitive to me. I can imagine that in a simpler environmental context where women have lower expectations of them, that even though there might be more drudgery involved, that maybe there's less opportunity for all that headspace that for some people is an opportunity to create, and for other people is an opportunity to get depressed.
Oh, that is such a valid point. Okay, you just hit on essentially what I have been obsessing over all day. I get into these headspaces that I think is the tipping point between what you're talking about. This idea of, I suppose, I think it's an egocentric space of perfectionism, perhaps, because yes, I want to be able, give me all the space, give me all the headspace. I want to be able to create naturally. I'm a creator, I'm an artist, I'm an actor, I'm a writer, I'm a podcaster, I'm a filmmaker, I do fine paint, I any which way I want to create constantly. I don't think that makes me unique. I think we are all creators, and I don't think what I'm about to say is something that makes me unique either. Perhaps it makes me quite the opposite, that this is something that we all are this is sort of something that I think maybe connects it. I'll preface it by saying that I believe there are different sorts of discomforts. And while I've not often been uncomfortable materially speaking, and that's, again, relatively speaking, I've, not had to worry about where my next meal is going to come from. I've not had to worry about having a roof over my head, except for that one birthday that my dad kicked me out and I had to sleep in a park. And by that, I mean, I sat there for an hour and my mom drove by and picked me up because it was just a weird argument. But, I've always had caring parents that no matter what have always, I've been born into privilege, and I've often found myself existentially uncomfortable, or at least existentially speaking. Most of the time I felt lacking in answers to the things that I cannot seem to stop thinking about. My concerns have been what my acting coach would call a rich man's problems, because in a sense that's true. Not having to worry about a lot of those material things in life. But for the better part of my life, the ratio of existential worries to any other kind has been greatly disproportioned. And so this is my privilege, my angst.
Yeah.
And I take it quite seriously, at least until I sort of feel sick, and then I have to let myself silly out for means of survival. But that idea of being highly critical of our own work, and that's what also draws us into the details and the fine touches that are oh so exquisite when we get to relish them from other authors and filmmakers. You know, it's the details that I want to devour. But it's that acute sense of criticism, any strength really overdone, can become a weakness, and it's a slippery slope from enjoying that perfectionism, being able to play in that open space when it's given to you, whether you're a woman or not, whoever you are. When you get that space and you feel like you have this sense of freedom, being able to play in that at the height of your intelligence with the muses at the top of the branches, the slipping into self-doubt and self-sabotage and self-criticism to a destructive degree, that so easily leads to depression and isolation and more egocentric thinking. So, you know, I think you're hitting on this space that at least what I've been journaling about a lot today has been about this idea of getting out of my own way. And I don't know if this is something that others who have, you know, been in isolation and had to sit with themselves and their own thoughts and have hit this sort of wall as well, or if this is just something that I've been experiencing for my creativity. And
no, it's archetypal, Caleigh. It's archetypal. The creative left alone with the space to dwell on their thoughts has the opportunity to create and the opportunity to self-immolate as well, in a little combustible pile of human neuroticism. And it is human. So when I was listening to you talk, I wanted to say that's my talking point then that I want to get to, that while there might be female conservative support for saying, hey, look, let's outlaw abortion because women should just be able to know that their primary purpose is to have babies and keep houses. To say, actually, it's a human condition to say when we have greater freedom, we have greater opportunity to be miserable as well, because that is part of humanity. We are not, I mean, I don't want to put down animals because animals might have extremely rich emotional lives, and I think they probably do, that we just don't have access to because we don't speak their languages. But humans, when they have greater freedom, have greater opportunities to create as well as greater opportunities to despair. That's just the nature of imaginative potential. And if we make that just a woman problem to say, no, we have to save the little ladies from despair by making sure they have a simple circle of expectations. Just pop out the babies and give them cookies and sandwiches, and that's all you have to worry about. So really we're here to save you, or we're here to save ourselves, where there's probably a lot of conservative investment in that idea of saving women. Because we talk about the negative side of it, that yes, they are controlling women. There's a lot of implicit slut shaming, like, oh, you wouldn't have gotten pregnant if you didn't consent to sexual activity in the first place. And women are clearly the gatekeepers of sexual purity and blah, blah, blah. I want to anchor it to men's experiences and say men too can do anything they want with their lives. And when they have that freedom, they're not going to allow people to take it from them just because there's a potential downside of getting depressed when you don't live up to your own expectations in your own arbitrary timeline, or even in a societal timeline, like, oh, you haven't done shit by the time you're 30, you won't do anything. It's not true. Lots of men will subsequently turn around and do things. And if I can connect that story to any men who are tempted to support reproductive coercion, or any women who are tempted to say, yeah, it just seems safer for me if there's no abortion, if you take that option off the table. It seems more comforting to ladies. I want to be able to intuitively reach them where they're at so that we can debate it and move potentially the debate needle in a in a respectful way.
Yeah, well, and that's I would not profess to know any answers to how to go about that. I think that the only thing that is constant is change. As you mentioned, change is something that many people can be uncomfortable with. And when it comes to, I mean, I guess politically speaking, shifting the needle, and not just politically speaking, but making those change, culturally, socially, even just for an individual in their own lives, whatever it is that they're looking to change. I think that this is where more of my curiosity sits. The idea of change itself is inevitable, and yes, it can be scary, but it's also the thing that is kind of exciting because it offers the new. And you were talking about that you were using the word new, that tethered to this idea of something better to come, and that's absolutely true. You will always find something exciting, or I think the excitement of life is being able to be surprised, and you have to have something that you're not expecting, the unknown, the new, come into your life to have that sense of, things aren't exactly how I thought they were. Life is not stagnant and it's not done. I haven't figured everything out. Here's something else to spice up the pot. You kind of need that in life, but a lot of the way that we shape our messaging to try to tilt that needle one way or the other is either done from a place of trying to ignite the passion of what people can find if they venture into that dark unknown, in storyteller terms, or from a place of fear and trying to, and both of them, psychologically speaking, research has shown that they both are, I don't know if motivational is the right word, because I think that speaking from a place that draws people towards a passion or something that is just, it's more of a drawing, not of a pushing. I think that is more inspiration. And that is probably not in line with scientific terminology. I think it actually is behavioral motivation that is probably in the science text or psychology textbooks. But as far as fear goes, fear is a very valid motivational tool. And it's not necessarily, it's only once you put it into context that it can become in terms of judging things, good or bad entity. I think that your brain, essentially, the way that we work psychologically is that we can become afraid of staying in bad patterns, bad habits. And that is a good thing, to be afraid of staying in that, because they probably don't serve you. And if you want to make changes in your life, that serves as fire under your butt. But there's also the other aspect, like I was saying, that is more of a drawing toward a vision that you see down the line on the horizon that is, I don't know proportionally which one does drive more than the other. I think it's probably a contextual thing, but they're both motivational.
Yes. I'm writing down a book title of The Ordeal of Change, which I think sounds interesting as well. All of our emotions are motivators in various directions. And I like what you're saying, because when we can when we can harness the power of those different emotional states and recognize maybe what they are trying to protect us from or what they're trying to open us up to, we can be so much more conscious in our ability to move ahead.
Yeah, I love that your audience member just recommended that. That was something that I think somebody recommended it to me a while ago, and I couldn't remember, and I didn't write it down. So I just wrote it down right now, because law of attraction or something brought it back into my life. That's amazing. The idea of change is actually what, before we hopped on this call, sort of what the other director friend that I mentioned, who I met over Clubhouse, what we were talking about in terms of our responsibility as storytellers, the types of narratives that we do share. And I'm not just talking about the ones that are recognizable, as far as like Kurt Vonnegut style goes, the Cinderella story of rags to riches, or from riches to poor, like not just the typical structures that we do see modern day that are still very much so the hero's journey that seems to be the only one that marketers use these days. It's not the only kind of story that exists. And this is something else that I've kind of been obsessing with over the past year and a half or so. The fact that the idea of the hero's journey, which is individualistic, it centers it on the individual hero that has to essentially go through the dark night of the soul and sacrifice some part of himself that or herself that is seemingly essential, burn it down and become the phoenix that rises again, and then to be able to deliver this wisdom or truth back to the community. We see it across different cultural narratives. We've seen it across generations of times. These are things that, and this is not my wisdom, this is something that people like Carl Jung studied, and Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is exactly what they're talking about, that has been paralleled across time and communities, that are the same story that we've been telling around the fireside since day one, that are motivational stories that do have some sort of impregnated morale or teaching that is supposed to be passed on the same way that the hero does pass on that wisdom to the community when he returns from his journey. But what I have been contending with is that we haven't bothered to look deeper than that with the ways we tell stories or give our messages across to audiences for how, since the dawning of media, the same story structure is used in politics, in our arc plot structured Hollywood-esque films that don't just live in Hollywood anymore, but have bled out into much of the independent film world. But there are independent films, and there are independent different like theater storytellers and poets, especially poets are the ones to look to, who don't stick to forms, because it is within every single layer of your storytelling that you will affect your audience on the deepest unconscious levels. And so we've been telling stories that have, many are very surface. And you've heard that term, I'm sure, before, just in terms of like, it's a surface movie because it was a rom-com that never really got deep into the nitty-gritty of life. And I don't want to discount rom-coms, because there are some fabulous and beautifully structured rom-coms and that are well played out by incredible actors. But my point of what I was talking about with my director friend was that the idea of individuality, which is very Western thinking, is something that I'm wondering, I don't have the answers, but I'm curious if we were to change the kinds of stories, the shapes of stories that are not just arc plot, but are anti-plot, or I can't remember the third that's proposed by, I think it might be Robert McKee in his book called Story. I'll have to look it up. But there are different formats that if we were to change the way we address the audience member, would that change how they accept the change or hear the message? And it was Solzhenitsyn that links the existential failure of the individual to the mass catastrophes of society. And so I get why centralizing stories around a hero, the individual, helped highlight the primary lesson of the 20th century. But are we ready for deeper connection? And or if we sway away from that, are we going to fall prey to ideologies like Hitler's?
I'm just noting that John is going to go, and I'll say, hey, peace out. John, thanks for joining in with us, and hope you enjoy the replay. He noted also that the individual is often hyper-emphasized in North America. I'm saying North America, so I include Caleigh as well in Canada. And I'm just going to bring up something quite interesting. It's going to sound tangential to what you're saying, but I think it's complementary, which is that in various journalistic exposés of fossil fuel industries, like companies like Exxon, they've discovered that the playbook that they've been following for decades is not just to try and discredit the science of climate change, but to frame the conversations to be more based on individuals and individual consumption pattern, to minimize any role that they play, collectively speaking, as fossil fuel companies. And I'm wondering if that's influenced the role of hyper-individualism in American cultural life, that there have been very powerful corporations intent on framing narratives as being all about individual choice, so that then the arguments we have are about individual choice. Are we all individually choosing to recycle or not? And we can look at each other and judge each other on our individual choices, but then there's less attention being paid to these collective decisions being made at higher up levels of whether or not to spend billions of dollars subsidizing fossil fuel industries. And just that's something for you, Caleigh, because you're clearly debating the role of individual hero narratives and storytelling, and that, yes, maybe women are very invited into that in their daily lives to go, am I being an individual environmental hero, when we really need to be pushing for more effective collective action at a political level. And instead, our energies are all bound up in judging ourselves for how well we're performing on this individual journey of recycling and trying to do various things we deem good for the environment.
Yeah, well, and I don't, like I said, I don't profess to know the answers, but it's just something that I am so curious about, that I don't know if we will ever find the answer as to whether things can be broken down to the individual. And I think that there does come great shift when we are able to sit with ourselves and find an awareness that comes from within. That's something that can instigate change, and doing it at the individual level is something that can be amplified if we find that morality within ourselves. But there's also, and maybe that's what these companies are doing, they're trying to put the spotlight on us so that, the same way that sitting in front of a camera makes us realize we are being seen, that there is something to be essentially judged in a way, and the awareness, the self-awareness that comes with that. I think that can go tangentially, and I won't move into that territory as far as being on camera right now. But I'll put it with this conversation about targeting the individual versus targeting masses. And we have seen studies from psychology about that group psychosis or mob mentality, that if somebody isn't pointed out to, say, call an ambulance or a doctor when somebody has fallen, that you just you have the mob mentality that makes you stand back, and I'm generalizing, but makes you stand back and say to yourself, somebody else will probably call. And there's just something that kind of holds you back from taking that action. I think that's also why we're interested in hero stories, because the people that sort of bypass that and don't fall victim to mob mentality, but have, I don't know, a big enough heart, quote unquote, to just reach for the phone and call and take charge and start directing people so that they can organize that situation. We like that kind of organization. It's a very left brain sort of mentality. And this is why the idea between left brain and right brain is the reason why I don't think we will ever quite find, or I haven't yet found the answer to whether individuality or group community mentality is going to instigate more effective change in the world. Because as far as the left brain, right brain mentality goes, and a lot of people will attribute creatives as right brain people because it's supposed to be tethered to the idea of creativity. But what I've been learning from my obsession of psychology, and we haven't really gotten into why I became so obsessed past my university days. I did study it, but my film life actually pushed me further down my studying with psychology. And I've been recently listening to podcast episodes from a psychiatrist, interviewing a psychiatrist named Ian McGilchrist, who does work specifically in terms of what the left brain does and what the right brain does, and how they are so vastly different, but still, to get along in our world, seemingly so important, because the left brain is the one that labels and compartmentalizes and is not only logic oriented or rationalizing everything, but it puts things in categories. And once it knows those things, it knows what it knows. And whatever is outside of that, it doesn't even know that it does not know that. So this is its world, and you try to show it something else that doesn't fit into one of those categories, and it will not even acknowledge it. It'll probably get mad, because that's also what's the side of the brain that's attributed to the emotional capacity that drives you over the edge like that. And then the right brain is the one that's allowed to, not allow, but more geared towards the processes that allow us to take in the entire world as a whole, the gestalt of it all, the fact that you cannot have a subject without a background from which you extract it from to see that subject. That's the right side of the brain that understands it's not just a subject, it is something that is a part of the rest of the whole. So if we have these two halves of our brain that are doing such different and important things, maybe the individual thinking or compartmentalizing or segregation is important and can motivate, much like love and fear can motivate, or passion and fear. And then the idea of everything being connected, the way that the right brain sees everything as one, as whole, being just as important. And especially from what I've learned from my studies in Buddhism and becoming a yogi, a yoga instructor, and learning the Upanishads. And it's, I think that they both are valid, and that maybe there is no answer to choose between the two.
Yes, well, I wanted to say you are pursuing exactitudes in a world that shifts and changes, and we always only have a fragmented ability to perceive truth at all. So in a way, your quest has an element of self-defeat built into it. But that's what motivates creatives, isn't it? Is the pursuit of the unknowable, and the pursuit of elevating our understanding of things. Even if you're never going to find an exact answer, it's that pursuit that makes you who you are and gives you the right to use that label, which everybody may have the potential to use the label of being a creative, but some people actualize it. So
yeah, but it's that part, like we were saying earlier, that any strength overdone can become a weakness. So just because I have this insatiable curiosity that, sometimes I'll go 3 days without eating or sleeping, and I know that that is unhealthy, and I pay for it later. And just as much as I know that that is unhealthy, there's this part of me that when I get into that zone, I don't know why I do it to myself, but there's something that just will not allow me to stop. And in a sense, I kind of feel possessed if I stay, and usually it's writing. Sometimes it's different forms of art, but for the most part, it's writing for me. And I will wake up with notes all over my floor. I call them floor notes, but my condo will be covered in pages and notebooks that are filled. And it's one of those things that sometimes I do wish that I could just chill a little bit, but that when it is gone and when I don't feel that spark of creativity, that's when that feeling of depression and feeling lost and feeling like I'm disconnected comes in. That same tipping point that we were talking about before. So there's, I suppose, a balance that can be found there too.
Well, it was lovely talking with you, Caleigh. We filled the whole pro-democracy hour with, I guess, a look at how the artistic temperament can be harnessed to consider some of these weighty issues that lie before us as we consider how not to just tell stories that resonate with each other, but how to find answers that fit the human condition, how to find ways to pragmatically better ourselves, whether that be through rejecting some individualistic framing from petrochemical companies and find more collective ways of talking about ourselves and having more collective sympathies as well, which you can see sometimes in their absence when people won't wear masks and won't get vaccinated because they frame everything as an individual choice and they no longer feel themselves to be connected to the fates or outcomes of their community. They're like, no, my individual considerations are paramount to this debate, and I am not going to take on board what you're saying about facts about community transmission or community success in containing a virus through herd immunity, through something collective. So the role of the collective versus the individual is really a hot button topic for the moment. Thank you for talking with me, Caleigh. It was lovely. And thank you so much to Bob, who's been here in the comments suggesting all these awesome books and telling us that after he read The Ordeal of Change, almost every book he had read before seemed trivial. Now, that's a hell of a recommendation for that book. So
yeah, that's what that book wants on its dust cover. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, you should write to the author and say, yeah, the name Bob Kramer might not be very recognized, but I think that's worth it for the power of this quote. And then everybody will want that quote on their dust jacket.
I definitely do.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Caleigh, and thank you to the audience. There's someone who's just joined and subscribed called Helga, who's saying hello from Amsterdam. Hello, Helga. Cyber Grief was here too. Bob, you're a valuable player, and so are you, John. Marsha was here, and I didn't even see. Hello, Marsha. Sorry, I missed you. Christopher was here. Thank you, Christopher. And somebody accidentally muted Phil's quote about how keeping him dependent, barefoot, and pregnant is kind of like, is seemingly a motto for the Republican Party sometimes. Is that everybody? Perry Pilot was here. Yes, John says linguistics are Dav's area of relative expertise, so that's true. That's why I like getting in language conversations with actors who do know the importance of word selection for shaping how much an audience buys into a story, and that it's a precise calling as a writer to make choices and to delineate archetypes in a way that help an audience buy into a story and go, okay, that's the villain and that's the hero, and this is the journey that we expect to be taken on. And it sounds like Caleigh's really keen on writing some journeys that don't fit into those archetypal hero journey molds. So good luck with that, Caleigh. Let us know.
Thank you for having me on. It's always a joy to speak with you. And yeah, I think the work that I do, as well as myself, and we're all anomalies, essentially. I do hope that, whatever the field is that people take on, the point of either politics or being a writer or an actor, I think the point of consciousness is just to come to appreciate the meaning of truth and goodness and beauty.
Lovely. You're such a creative. Yes, beauty, truth. Somebody says hello from Reno. Is Reno in Texas? I associate it with divorce. Caleigh won't necessarily know, being Canadian, so we'd have two non-Americans here speculating on a place.
And being not divorced.
What did you say?
And being not divorced.
Being not divorced, yes. But it was in a movie about women who got divorced from the 1950s, I think. Not Ingrid Bergman in it, but maybe Olivia Havilland. And it was called The Women, and they went to Reno anyway.
Reno, Nevada.
Oh, Nevada. Thank you. Yes. Perry Pilot says, thanks, Dav. Looking forward to seeing Caleigh in the next big Hollywood blockbuster.
Oh, thanks, Perry.
and Perry Pilot's taking up Bob's recommendations for his reading list with The Ordeal of Change. I'm blown away by Bob's recommendation, so I definitely am adding that to my reading list as well. And it sounds like it's already on Caleigh's reading list because of her director friend. I'll say thank you so much to everybody who was here with us today. I'm looking at the title that says Live Interview with Actor Caleigh LeGrand. We did that. Also, Tom Cotton. Didn't really touch on that, so I'll say something. Tom Cotton is a US Senator, and what did he argue? He argued that the AP, the Associated Press, that had a building in the Gaza Strip that was bombed recently, he argued that they were colluding with Hamas, which is an extraordinary accusation to make. I think the Biden administration so far, Secretary Blinken has said he hasn't seen any evidence that there was Hamas activity in the Associated Press building. There was warning given of an hour for them to evacuate, but I think there is still a casualty, some child casualties and adult casualties associated with bombing that building. But yes, that's just Tom Cotton. He's someone who people sometimes say they're afraid of because he's like Trump, but smarter. But the thing is, Trump's performative stupidity is much more of an electoral advantage than people would give him credit for. That's why I'm not that scared of Tom Cotton. So that's my Tom Cotton remarks, and now I've covered everything I promised to cover in the title of today's broadcast. But most importantly and centrally, we had a live interview with actor Caleigh LeGrand. Thank you so much for your time and attention, everyone. Take care.